Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We'll just wait a moment to let everyone to come into the room. Okay. Hey, hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. The topic for today's webinar is top tips for applying for charity registration. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which I'm presenting today. For me, that's the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. I'd like to acknowledge their elders, both past and present, and any Aboriginal people who are joining us for today's webinar. We acknowledge that this was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name's Anna McGilvray. I'm a senior lawyer with the not-for-profit law team at Justice Connect. Today, we're very lucky to have two guest presenters from the ACNC, the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. We have Vladimir Klendo, who's a law interpretation specialist at the Registration Directorate at the ACNC. In this role, Vladimir gives technical advice to stakeholders on complex charity entitlement matters, as well as contributing to strategic and policy initiatives. Before this, Vladimir worked in various roles in the ACNC, including as acting senior manager, team leader, and law interpretation analyst. He's also worked at the Australian Tax Office and the State Revenue Office of Victoria. Vladimir has a passion for the charity and not-for-profit sector, having previously worked for a charity and being involved in various not-for-profit organisations, both as a volunteer and as a board member. We're also lucky to have Gulnar Gahuli, Communications and Media Officer, here today. So Gulnar works at the Education and Public Affairs Directorate of the ACNC. And in this role, she uses her education and service delivery background to create educational materials for the charity sector. Before joining the ACNC, Gulnar worked in various capacities within public and private sectors, including the ATO as well. So Vladimir and Gulnar are here to talk to us about applying for charity registration. Now, although this is a really important topic for many not-for-profits, it's particularly relevant given the recent changes to the income tax reporting requirements. Specifically, there's changed requirements for not-for-profits who self-assess as income tax exempt. So from 1 July 2023, non-charitable not-for-profits with an active ABN that self-assess as income tax exempt will be required to lodge a self-assess review return with the ATO. Now, this change wasn't there before, and it doesn't apply to registered charities. So as a result, this may mean that quite a lot of not-for-profits are considering whether they're eligible for charitable registration and what's involved. So Vladimir and Gulnar will answer these questions and more today. So our hope is that at the end of the session today, you'll walk away with a better understanding of who is eligible for registration, how to apply, and how to ensure that registration process is as smooth as possible, and also where you can find further resources to help you. Before I hand over to Vladimir and Gulnar, I wanted to run through some housekeeping for how today's webinar will work and tell you a little bit, very briefly, about not-for-profit law at Justice Connect. So not-for-profit law is a specialised legal program of the charity Justice Connect, and we're here to help organisations, not-for-profits, charities and social enterprises, and we do this in a number of ways. We have over 300 freely available resources on our website to support you in your work as not-for-profit. We also have in-house legal advice service for eligible organisations. If your matter is complex and outside the skills of our in-house legal team, we can refer you to one of our 50+ pro bono law firms who are members of our organisation. So we also are involved in advocacy. So we advocate for the changes to the law in the not-for-profit sector. And recently we've been working on our fixed fundraising campaign. Lastly, we run a certified social enterprise providing easy to understand training like today's session, and any profits we make go back to Justice Connect to continue with our social justice work. So that's a little bit about not-for-profit law. Now, there are quite a lot of us on the webinar today, so if you would like to ask a question, please do so in the Q&A function, and that way we can easily track and manage the questions. And you also have an opportunity to remain anonymous. Vladimir and Gunnar have reserved some time to answer a few questions after each of the topics they're going to cover today. And we also should hopefully have a little bit of time at the end. So please feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A function at any time. I'll be monitoring those questions and we'll try to come to them. We won't be able to answer all questions today, but we'll do our best to get as many as we can done. Just a reminder also today that the information we will provide in this webinar is just that. It's information only. So it shouldn't be relied upon as legal advice or advice on registration that's specific to your organisation. So you should seek legal advice about your own particular circumstances. Okay. Just also a quick note to say that this session may qualify for points through the CPD program for professional leaders of volunteers that's endorsed by Volunteering Australia. So if you feel that you're wanting to cover those, I suggest you contact the APEEC in your state. Finally, we will send a copy of the slides and the recording to you in the next few days. So thank you. That's it for me. I will now hand over to Gulnar to talk us through the topic today.
Thank you so much, Anna, and a big thank you to all of you for taking the time to register and attend this webinar today. So let's have a quick look at what we will cover today. So we are going to look at, why an organization may consider registering with the ACNC. So, what are some of the benefits of charity registration? We'll also look at who is eligible for charity registration. So obviously there are some criteria that you need to consider if you want your organization to apply for charity registration. So we'll have a look at that. And the most anticipated section of the webinar, I suppose, we will cover some really useful tips that will help you to prepare your registration application and, make sure that that the process is a smooth one and that we can help you to either reduce or avoid, any follow-up inquiries from us if there's missing information or if there's incomplete information in your application. So that's the plan. And as I said, I hope you'll find this a valuable session. So without further delay, I'm going to hand it over to Vlad and he'll speak to you and discuss the benefits of charity registration. Take it away, Vlad.
Thank you, Gulnar, and thank you, Anna, for your introduction. So first and foremost, we're going to start with why register with the ACNC. And to be honest, there are probably multiple answers to that question, and a lot of the answers will be individual to your organization. But as Anna already alluded, one of the issues that the sector is currently facing is that there are changes to non-for-profit, tax regulations that ATO is currently conducting. And so the entities that are eligible for ACNC registration are encouraged to apply to the ACNC to make sure that they maintain their tax breaks. And of course, there are tax breaks that are certain tax concessions that are eligible for registered charities. Now, that may include income tax concessions. It may also, depending on the type of your charity, you may also have what's called deductible gift recipient, DGR category, although that doesn't cover all charities naturally. There may also be other exemptions like fringe benefit tax exemptions, again, depending on the type of charity you have. If we can move on with the slide now, please, Anna. So in terms of other benefits outside of the tax concessions, now naturally, again, tax concessions is something that often is the first thing that is promoted with charity registration, but it is far from the only one. So if you are registered as a charity, you will be listed on the ACNC charity register as a registered charity. So it's certainly one way for a non-for-profit organization to, I guess, increase its public profile and be known in the community. So if you are seeking donors or seeking volunteers, etc., it is certainly helpful to be registered as a charity with ACNC and be there on the ACNC register. There may also be other factors. So, for instance, some grant-making bodies, they may also be looking out specifically to register charities rather than just register organizations broadly. So, again, if you're looking for donors, if you're looking for grants or volunteers, you may have better luck being a registered ACNC charity than otherwise. And very importantly these days, since there is a lot of red tape everywhere, sometimes certain types of organizations, if they are registered as an ACNC registered charity, it will reduce their reporting elsewhere. So naturally, ACNC charities, they can include all sorts of legal entities. There may be public companies or private companies, or there may be incorporated associations or unincorporated associations, etc., etc., etc. So there are a lot of reporting requirements that go with the depending on the type of entity you are, or you operate, and having ACNC registration may help it streamline for you, so that you don't have to report to all sorts of different entities at the same time. As you can see there on the screen, there is a link, acnc.gov.au/whyweregister. Strongly encourage you to visit ACNC website if you are looking to register as a charity. There is a lot, not only talking about the benefits of registration, but it goes through a whole heap of information in general that'll be very useful for you to consider before applying for charity registration. If we can move on now, Anna. Okay. So in terms of reporting requirements for NFPs, which is, I alluded to that already, and Anna already alluded to that as well, from 1st of July 2023, the non-for-profits that have an ABN and are not registered with the ACNC would be required to lodge a self-review return with the ATO. So it's a self-assessing return to basically confirm whether they're entitled for self-assessing or not. Naturally, we are not in a position here to discuss much about that. That's something you have to reach out to the ATO about. But what we can say is that naturally, charities that are registered with ACNC, they don't have to be part of that process. They will get the tax exemptions that they're eligible for as a result of being charities. All right, let's go straight ahead. Okay, so in terms of the receiving those tax concessions, in order for you to receive, or in order for your organization to receive the tax concessions from the ATO, you need to apply to ACNC first before the ATO endorsement. So in fact, what actually happens is when you are submitting your charity registration application, you fill out the application to the ACNC, and at the bottom, you would also list any tax exemptions, tax concessions, etc., that you are requesting. So it's actually a convenient format. It's a dual format for both of those things. So once we find, if you are approved as a charity, if you're registered with ACNC, then your information is automatically followed on to the ATO. Now, of course, if there is further information, then they will reach out accordingly. But for most organizations, it's a pretty streamlined process. You kind of kill two birds with one stone. All right, let's move on. Any questions so far?
We have had a question about getting some assistance in terms of starting up your not-for-profit. We do have lots of resources on that, as does the ACNC. So I'll show you where to find that at the end of the session today. And I'm sure Vladimir and Gunnar will let you know where those resources are on the ACNC website as well. That's all. Thanks, Vladimir.
Thank you. Yes, there will be lots of links towards the end. And as I already mentioned, I strongly encourage every prospective charity registration applicant to have a very long browse through the ACNC website. Okay, so now we're moving on to possibly the most important part of the presentation, that is the eligibility to be registered as a charity. Now, not every single non-for-profit organization will be eligible to be a charity. So there are many groups in the community that do amazing work, and they provide a lot of benefit to the community, to the society, but they don't necessarily meet the registration requirements to be an ACNC registered charity. So when we, if you do apply and it turns out that you're not actually eligible, that is not at all a comment on the validity of your enterprise. It's not at all a comment on the benefit that you're providing. It just means that you don't meet very specific requirements that ACNC is looking for pursuant to the legislation. All right, let's move on. All right, so in very basic terms, to be registered as a charity, an organization must be a non-for-profit organization. That probably covers most of the attendees in the room, but in case we need any more information, so that is basically non-for-profits are types of organizations that don't operate for the benefits of their members, of their founders, of the relatives of the founders, but they operate for the purpose that they're set up for. So an entity needs to have only charitable purposes for the public benefit. Now, it's a twofold criteria. So charitable purposes we'll cover in a bit more detail in a minute, but it's also important that it's for the public benefit. So it's not set up to benefit a exclusive group. It's not set up to benefit a family or a group of members or anything like that. It's meant to be setting up to benefit either the general public or a significant section of the general public. So that may include a certain types of beneficiaries, or it may include a group in need, or it may include a municipality or a locality, but it needs to be a substantial, significant group of the community. So a charity cannot have a disqualifying purpose. So that can cover a variety of things. So they can't go against Commonwealth policy. Now, charity can argue and make advocacy submissions or policy submissions, but it can't do anything against an established Commonwealth policy, and it can't act against the law. It also is not a political entity. Again, while it can comment on policies, etc., it cannot support political candidates or political parties. And while individuals, political parties, or government agencies can be considered to be entities, they're not the types of entities that can be registered as a charity by ACNC. Again, there is a link at the bottom, acnc.gov.au, who can be registered. So it talks in a bit more detail about these requirements. So prior to applying, you need to make sure that, and just to be clear, all of these requirements, they are important. So even if you meet all the other criteria, but if you don't meet a single criterion, we cannot register you. So make sure that prior to applying, you go through all of these criteria to make sure that your entity meets all of them. All right, let's go ahead, Anna. All right, so there are additional criteria as well. The organization needs to have an ABN. So that means it has to be an active ABN. It can't be post-dated. It can't be cancelled. It needs to be an ABN that is actually currently active, and we can only register a charity from the date the ABN has become valid. So if there are any issues with ABN, Australian Business Register is an entity to contact, and to make sure that all the details are correct and up to date. An entity needs to comply with ACNC governance standards. So that we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But again, ACNC website provides a lot of great information about the governance standards and what are the requirements that an entity would be required to meet. And if the entity is operating outside of Australia, in addition to all of the above, there are also additional standards called external conduct standards. And that is to make sure that if an entity sends its volunteers or staff, or if it sends funds or resources overseas, that there is sufficient oversight over those activities and resources being sent outside or being sent overseas. All right, let's move ahead. Any questions so far?
We've got one question that says the association was set up in February this year. If they start to register with the ACNC now, will the charity status start from the time the association was founded or from the date it is approved?
So it's actually a great question. So it will be it could be from the date of the application, but they can apply retrospectively up to 3rd of December 2012, which is when ACNC first started, assuming all the criteria were met. So the ABN would have had to be active. Entity would have had to be established. So, for example, if it is, let's say, incorporated association, it would have had to be incorporated, or if it's a company, it would have had to be incorporated pursuant to the Corporations Act. So the entity would have to have come into being. That's a very, the crucial point. ABN would have had to be active, and it would have had to meet all those requirements that I just mentioned. It would have had to operate as a non-for-profit entity. It would have had to operate for charitable purposes for the public benefit, not have any disqualifying purposes, etc., etc., etc. So assuming all those criteria were met, assuming it was operating for charitable purposes, we sometimes accept charities that request backdated registration all the way back to 30th December 2012. Most of the time these days it's probably not as applicable, but most of the entities these days ask for from the time they were established or close to that time. That's totally fine, but we may ask sufficient proof. For example, if you had governing document, that's something we're going to talk about in more detail in a second. If there are governing rules that have been amended, we may ask for preceding governing document. We may ask for preceding annual reports. We may ask for preceding financial reports. So the longer, I guess, the time of the requested registration, the more evidence we may need to ensure that the charity was always operating as a charity, right? So that's a very important point. So the more, I guess, for those organizations that do seek backdating for whatever reason, due to tax breaks or for whatever reason they're asking for, it is important to, I guess, prepare as many documents for those relevant periods as possible.
Right. Just one more question, Vladimir, on this topic. If the not-for-profit charges a membership fee, does that disqualify it from being registered?
Not at all. So charities and non-for-profits collect funds through all sorts of means, right? So it can be collecting membership fees. It can also be doing some sort of fundraising activity, even including some commercial operations. So, for example, if a charity operates for a charitable purpose, but it has an op shop or something, or if it has some sort of fundraising appeal, it's totally valid for charity to be raising funds, because that's how they fund their operations. They need to be able to do that to pursue their purpose. Now, there is a flip side to that, is that you can't be solely using the charity to support the members. If you set up not for the public benefit, but the organization is set up as being, for example, being like a social club for the members, or if it's a sporting club. Well, sporting is not a charitable purpose anyway. We can talk about that later. But if it's set up solely for a restricted group, such as a membership group, and they're the sole beneficiary of this entity, then most likely, I'm not saying always, but most likely, it would fail to meet the public benefit test. So collecting having members is totally fine. Most charities do, not all of them, but most of them do. Collecting membership fees from the members is totally fine, just like fundraising it through other means is totally fine. You just need to make sure that the organization, to be a charity, is using those funds for charitable purposes, not for the benefit of members.
We might, I'll let you get on to the next topic. If we don't, we'll try to come to some more questions at the end, but we'll push through it at this point. Thank you.
Registration. we can just move on from that.
Oh.
Okay. All right. So governing document. Now, obviously, these are important items that we need to consider when we are looking at registration requirements. So governing document is a first point of call, and that is actually pursuant to our legislation. When we assess charity entitlement, we'll look at the governing rules, we'll look at the activities, and we'll look for other relevant matter that concerns the organization. So what is a governing document? Well, governing document is what, I guess, for most of the organizations, for 90% of the organizations, that's something that sets up what the charity is set up for. So its purpose, charitable or otherwise, its objects, and also how it's set up. For example, that it's set up to be a non-for-profit entity, and also, very importantly, how it's governed. So to make sure that there are processes in place to address matters like conflict of interest provisions, financial management, etc. So make sure that it's a structured, well-governed organization. So if you don't know what a governing document is, your organization already probably has one. If you're an incorporated association, it may be called model rules. If it's a company, it's probably called constitution. If you operate a trust, you probably have a trust deed. So most of the organizations, in some shape or form, they have some version of a governing document. So it's important that before applying for charity registration, firstly, if you don't have access to it for whatever reason, you misplaced it or whatever, find out where the document is, because you'll be asked to provide a copy. And further, make sure that it meets the criteria for ACNC registration, that it is a non-for-profit organization, that it pursues the charitable purposes, etc., etc., etc. Again, the website acnc.gov.au is a good friend of yours. So acnc.gov.au governing document provides more info about the types of issues you may want to consider when reviewing your governing document before applying for charity registration. Let's move straight ahead. All right. So what does a governing document need to have? Well, it needs to actually state which organization it refers to. So it's a legal name of the organization. So we prefer for the actual legal name to be on the document. So not the trading name, not some other version of a name, but actually what the legal name of the entity is. So what is the company called, or what is the incorporated association actually called, right? It should have the charitable purposes, or what is known as objects. So that is, what is the charitable goal for which the entity is set up. So to be a charity, entity needs to be set up for a charitable purpose and be actively pursuing that purpose. So it's very important, actually, it's actually a twofold issue. Have the objects, but further, even as if your entity is registered as a charity, it's something that you always kind of need to go back to and review, so that the objects actually and your operations reflect one another. Activities and objects don't exist separately from each other, even though sometimes organizations can have a bit of a mission drift, in which case you need to go back to the objects and see if you need to amend anything. Okay, so as I keep alluding to, the entity needs to be a non-for-profit. So we often will ask an entity if it does not have the required clauses to actually state in its constitution or its in model rules that specifically it operates as a non-for-profit. So it does not operate for the benefit of members. It only operates as a non-for-profit for those charitable purposes. And importantly, also during winding up or dissolution, it can be once the entity is wound up, it no longer exists, the assets and the funds would only go to another charitable non-for-profit. It would not go to its members. The funds would not go to a director of the company. It would not go to a shareholder of the company, anything like that. During the dissolution, it would basically go to another charity. And of course, importantly, how is the organization managed? Is there a committee that comes together and makes decisions? How is this going to be elected? Are there annual meetings that the entity has? For example, associations often have annual general meetings where committees are elected, etc., etc. So these are the types of provisions that a governing document should have. Let's move on. Now, charitable purpose, this is very important. Sometimes when people think of charity, they have a very kind of narrow view of what a charity is. So, for example, it's only supporting people that are in need, and that's it. So that's not really the case in terms of the legal meaning of the word charitable purpose, of the words charitable purpose. And so there are specific charitable purposes, which you'll see in a second. They are outlined in the Charities Act. So when we talk about charitable purpose, we actually administer it in relation to the legislation, not in terms of that, I guess, the colloquial understanding of the term charity. So, and there are many, many, many different charitable purposes, but they're limited to those charitable purposes that you will see on your screen. So if an entity, again, I alluded to it at the start of the presentation, there are some organizations that do amazing work, and yet they don't meet those charitable purposes, in which case they would not be able to be registered as a charity, right? So some of the common examples would be, for example, sporting clubs. Most of us will say that sporting clubs do great. I guess they provide a great benefit to the community, and yet sport in itself is not something that we accept to be a charitable purpose. Now, there may be some organizations that use sporting activities to promote another charitable purpose. So for instance, advancing social public welfare, they may be engaging people that are in need in sport, and through that they achieve a charitable purpose of advancing social public welfare. That can and does happen, but sport in itself is not a charitable purpose. Likewise, leisure or hobbies, they would not be a charitable purpose either. So in terms of having recreational sort of a club or anything like that, would not actually meet a definition of a charitable purpose, because recreation is not a charitable purpose. Let's move ahead. All right, I'll read them out, but I mean, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about each individual charitable purpose. The link is there on the below, so please do visit the website and read in detail about specific charitable purposes. So we have advancing health, advancing education, advancing social public welfare, advancing religion, advancing culture. Moving ahead.
Yep. Sorry, have I missed one?
It's okay.
I'm too quick.
I think you just went back.
Oh, sorry.
Promoting reconciliation, mutual respect and tolerance between groups of individuals that are in Australia. That's this is an interesting one. I'll just touch upon that briefly. It's interesting. Most of the charitable purposes involve both Australia and overseas, but there are just a couple of purposes that you can see here on the screen that are linked to Australia only, and this is one of them. So we also have promoting and protecting human rights, advancing the security or safety of Australia or the Australian public. Here's another one. Preventing or relieving the suffering of animals. Let's move on. Advancing the natural environment. Other similar purposes beneficial to the general public, and promoting or opposing a change to any matter established by law, policy, or practice in the Commonwealth, a state, a territory, or another country, where the change furthers or opposes one or more of the purposes listed. So the only two probably that are worth mentioning separately would be the other purposes beneficial to the general public. Again, many purposes are beneficial to the general public. This purpose, while it sounds kind of generic, it's actually quite specific. That means it's purposes that are not listed above, but courts have deemed them to be charitable, right? So it's still very, very limited to actually being enshrined in law, in this case, common law. It's not, I guess, any benefit, because there are many organizations that are beneficial to the community and they still would not meet this purpose. And the last thing is promoting or opposing a change to any matter established by law, policy, or practice. As I alluded to earlier, many entities do engage in advocacy, to support or oppose policy or law changes. Charities can do that and often do, but it needs to be specific type of advocacy, which is to further one of the charitable purposes, which is the purposes that are listed above. So just promotion or advocacy broadly, not in furtherance of the above charitable purposes, would not be a charitable purpose. So everything is always linked. It always comes back to actually supporting the charitable purpose. Okay, let's move ahead. All right. So we kind of touched upon that already. And basically speaking, objects, which is your objects clause in your governing document, that's the best way to have objects, which is to actually input them into your constitution or to your model rules. It's to have a specific clause that basically explains what the charity is set up to do. So it may be advancing religion, it may be advancing culture, it may be, now it does not need, I'm not saying that your objects should be our organization set up to advance religion, or advance culture, or advance social public welfare. But it should basically outline what the organization is set up to do, from which we can infer a charitable purpose. So, for instance, if you're saying that we are your organization is set up to relieve poverty in the community and to support people that are perhaps experiencing homelessness and or unemployed, things of that nature, we can infer from that your purpose would likely be advancing social or public welfare. Or, if a church has objects that speaks to, we have a church in the community where we worship, from that we can infer that it's likely advancing religion. On the ACNC website, there are actually specific examples of acceptable charitable purpose, charitable objects clauses. So you can actually use them as a bit of a template, but naturally, don't just copy paste them. Make sure that they actually fit the types of purposes that your organization is actually set up to do. All right, let's move ahead. All right, so activities will be a significant part of the application. So when an applicant submits a charity registration application, they will be asked to describe either their current or planned activities. So if it's a new organization, it may be the case that hasn't conducted any activities yet, but it's a good idea to have some sort of a plan as to which activities an entity is planning to conduct going forward. So to make sure that the organization actually meets, furthers its charitable purpose. I shouldn't say meets, because some purposes ultimately can never, some entities can be set up to further a purpose and the purpose is never achieved per se. So we're not, I guess, assessing the quality of the activities. We're not assessing if the goal is being met or anything like that, but the organization needs to be moving towards that object, towards that goal. So organization should have a clear idea of its activities and how they further the charitable purpose. Now, beneficiaries, I've touched upon the term before. What that means is, who is the organization actually set up to support? So this usually relates to advancing social or public welfare, but not solely. And it's to basically confirm why. That's okay.
Sorry, forward or back?
Back.
Sorry, not my best today. Go again.
Okay. Zoom and video presentations, they're always hard to do, and PowerPoint is always difficult. So when we talk about beneficiaries, we talk about who is the organization actually for. So, for example, is it set up to support people in need, or is it set up to support students, et cetera, et cetera? So when you're assessing that, that is a very important thing to consider when an applicant is applying for charity registration, is to consider who is the benefit actually flowing to, because as I alluded to earlier, it's not set up for its individual members or family members or responsible persons, committee members, anything like that. It's meant to be outwards facing. So, for example, is it set up for a certain community? Is it set up for a locale or a school community? Something like that. Something that would be a sufficient section of the public. All right, now Anna, you can move forward, and I will have a little breather, and I'll let Gulnar speak now.
Thank you, Vlad. So this entire section is actually focused on, what are some of the things that you need to have ready even before you, submit your application. So Vlad has already gone through the main details that you need to keep in mind. And this slide talks about responsible people. So when you're getting ready to submit your application, you need to have information about your responsible people ready. So you may ask, what do you mean by the term responsible people? So from our point of view, we refer to responsible people as, those who are responsible for governing your organizations. It could be, the board members or the committee members. If it's a company, it could be, the board of directors. So they're the ones who've got together and, they're the ones who are responsible for making sure that, good governance is being practiced. So at the time of application, the online application form will actually ask you for these details. So it's important to make sure that even before you start the application, that you've got all these important details so that your application doesn't get delayed further because of incomplete information. So what do you need? You need to have their full names. You need their dates of birth. You need their contact details. That includes, your mobile number for them, their phone numbers, their email addresses. You could also ask for their residential addresses and what their positions are. So if you have a set of board members, someone could be the treasurer, somebody else could be the secretary, someone could be the president. So what are the specific positions that each individual responsible person holds? You need to have all that information ready so that when you are submitting the application, you have provided us with all the important information. One common thing we see is that sometimes with the applications, applicants may just provide one responsible person's details. However, as per the setup of the organization, it actually requires 5 people to be responsible people enlisted for that particular charity. So it's important that you look at how many responsible people are required as per your organization's legal structure or legal setup, and then you ensure that you provide details for all of them in your application. Thank you, Anna. If you could move to the next slide, please. Now, we will look at how do you actually apply for charity registration. So we are digital by default, and so your application needs to be done online. And it's important that you actually create a portal account. So we do have a charity portal, and everything that a charity needs to do, even if it's a charity applicant or if it's a registered charity, all the forms that they need to submit need to be done through our online portal. So if you have never used the portal before, the very first step for you is to actually create an online portal account. So the instructions are there. So if you go to acnc.gov.au/charity portal, it takes you to the sign-in page, and there is actually a link there. It says, don't have an account, sign up now. And if you click on that link, it's pretty straightforward. It prompts you to take all the necessary steps, fill in on the information. And once you fill in the information and you hit create, you are able to create an individual portal account for yourself. So once you've created the portal account, you're in the charity portal. And if Anna can please move to the next slide, it shows you what you will see once you've logged in. So on the very first page, the home page or the landing page of the portal, you can see in that screenshot, it will say, welcome to the charity portal. And if you scroll down, and you can see that we have highlighted that particular form, it says apply to register a new charity. So that's the actual online form that you need to click on, and you need to complete and submit. And so all the information that you need to provide, which is relevant for your charity's registration application. And once you submit that form through the portal, it goes to the registration team, and then they'll have a look. And if they find that there's some information missing, they may get in touch with you and discuss that further with you. So again, it's important that you create your online portal account and that you submit your application through the portal. We have 2 very good resources on our website. One is the registration application checklist. Again, it has all the information, and it helps you to understand that these are all the things I need to have ready before I start the application. So I highly recommend that you review that checklist. That will help you with your application. And there is one which is called common questions. So it has a list of, it's almost like a frequently asked question section. So it may answer some of the questions that you may have about the application process itself. So both the resources are quite helpful. And if you could move to the next slide, Anna. Thank you. Now, this is very important because when you're applying for charity registration, and we often get inquiries from applicants who are so passionate about their cause, and they've submitted their application, and it's because of that passion that they have for what they're doing and what the organization has been set up to do, that they're so keen that the registration application is reviewed and that they get the registration status as soon as possible. Now, for us to help you achieve that, it's important that when you are submitting the application, that you first of all make sure that you've provided us all the important information that we need, that your application is not missing any information. Vlad has highlighted what are the different things that you need to consider and provide in the application. You also need to make sure that you've not provided us with inaccurate information, because again, that may mean that the registration team may have to get in touch with you and discuss that further, and it may mean that you may have to make some changes, or you may have to resubmit the application. So it's very important that you get this bit right, and that you make sure that your application has all the information and all the correct information. So that's one. The second point that is very important is that you must make sure that your charity is applying for the charity subtypes for which, it applies for charity subtypes that it is eligible for. Charity subtypes are further subcategories of charitable purposes that Vlad touched upon earlier. So we may often find that if you have not really understood what a particular subtype is, and you've applied for a subtype which actually has no connection with what activities and objects that your charity has been set up for and what it actually does, it may again mean that your application may get further delayed. So again, it's important to make sure that you understand this very well, and so that your application is smooth and straightforward. Vlad, would you like to add anything else when it comes to charity subtypes?
So charity subtypes, essentially subtypes should reflect the charitable purposes, which are the charitable purposes we talked about just earlier. There are two additional subtypes, which are public benevolent institution and health promotion charity. We unfortunately don't really have the time to go into a lot of details about each individual subtype, but essentially, again, I encourage everyone to jump onto ACNC website, have a look at different purposes. If you're interested in public benevolent institution or health promotion charity, there's also a lot of information there on those subtypes as well. And ultimately, what you need to consider, though, is that a purpose needs to be something that the charity is actively pursuing. So it's not just a small activity that it's doing. It's not a motivation of a charity. It's actually something that it is actively pursuing. So it has its objects and its activities, and also the public-facing materials that it's putting out. It's focused on a specific purpose. Now, an entity can have multiple charitable purposes. Some entities will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sometimes even more charitable purposes that they're actively pursuing, in which case, by all means, you can register with 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 charity subtypes, by all means. However, if it's just one charitable purpose that you're focused on, but there are other things that you may be motivated by, or you have a minor activity in that space, don't put that down as a charity subtype, because that's actually not a purpose, right? So a purpose needs to be something that is of substance in its own right. So it's something that your organization is actively pursuing. It's set up for that purpose, and it's actively pursuing that purpose. All right, any more questions?
We did have a couple of questions. We've got one that says, when you're applying to register as a charity with the ACNC, is there a feedback process with ACNC representatives to better your application?
I'm not sure if better your application is the really correct way, or, our approach is not to conduct quality assurance on applications. Our approach is to ensure that the right information has been submitted, and that's something that Gulnar was touching upon earlier. So if we receive an application, look, if an application comes in and there is a governing document with clear objects, with clear non-for-profit and wind-up clauses, we can see that it's set up for a charitable purpose. Then the application comes in and clearly outlines the activities that the organization does. If there is a website or Facebook page or anything like that that the entity has, it's linked there. If all the information is there, we may not actually even reach out to the applicant, to the client. We may just go ahead and register the charity, right? Now, if something comes in and it's very minimal with a description of its activities, right? Or it describes some of the activities but not the others, right? Or, as Gulnar alluded to earlier, it's clear that they're pursuing this purpose and it may be charitable, but they're applying for other subtypes that have nothing to do with the charitable purpose that the organization has been set up for, then that's when the registration analysts will have to either call or send out an email with a request for further information. And so it's not about necessarily providing feedback on the quality of the application. We don't do that. That's not our job. But it's about seeking out the further information of what is actually required to meet the charity entitlement, right? So that's point one. Point two is, I guess, something we call additional matters. Some applications come in and they have a lot of information, and we can see that broadly it is charitable, it meets the requirements. However, there may be minor things. So objects haven't been worded correctly. We don't understand what the objects mean, or not-for-profit clauses haven't quite met the requirements for whatever reason, haven't been worded in a way that actually prevents benefits from being distributed to members or what have you. So usually those things, they can be changed, can be amended through an entity coming together for a general meeting, or for a meeting, depending on the structure of the organization, meeting of trustees or what have you. We can reach out to the entity and say, look, we are broadly satisfied that you have a charitable purpose, that you meet all these criteria. However, there are a few things that you need to meet before we can actually proceed with the registration. And here are those things: amend the objects, amend the not-for-profit clauses, etc., etc., etc. So, and oftentimes the applicant will go ahead and very quickly amend those changes, and then we can resolve the issue very quickly. So, yes, we definitely do engage with the clients. ACNC is a friendly regulator. We're not just going to say no. We're not going to register you without providing reasons. Even if application is refused, we always provide reasons for why the application has been refused, right? So there's always engagement between us and the client. In fact, the least engagement happens is when we're satisfied with everything. If great information comes in, there is all the information we need to know. Like I said, we're probably not going to call, email, or anything like that. We're just going to go ahead and register. And then, of course, there'll be a confirmation email to say that you have been registered, so no one is left in any sort of a limbo. But if there are any issues with the application, we will reach out and we will contact. Now, having said that, that all takes time. So if you are waiting on a grant application, if you are waiting on some other matter that you need to attend to, I don't know, particulars of the 70-odd organizations that are 77 participants that are on the line currently, it is probably to your benefit, rather than waiting for us to engage with you. I would strongly encourage you to do as much homework as you can. Get on the ACNC website, put together as much information as you can. It's better to put in more information than less, right? So if you're thinking, oh, should I attach that annual report or not? Yes, attach it. If we don't need it, that's fine. It's better than the other way around, when we have to sort of send you an email and say, please send through those additional annual reports or strategic plan or what have you. So if whatever information you have, put it in, right? And then if we don't have to call you or whatever, great. But if you don't do that, again, everything can be resolved. We won't just blanket refuse you without contact. We will reach out to you and we will discuss. Last but not least, though, some organizations, as I alluded to earlier, they're just not charitable. So no matter how many things we can adjust, no matter how many, I guess, changes to governing document you make, if ultimately you're not set up to pursue a charitable purpose, if ultimately you're not set up as a non-for-profit organization, all those matters that I've alluded to earlier, for example, a political party would just never be a charity. It's just not going to happen, right? So some entities just will not be able to meet it. So no matter how much we engage with the client or what have you, most of the engagement will probably revolve around us reaching out to the client and say, look, you're not eligible. We suggest you withdraw this application because it's not going to be proceeding to registration. Any other questions?
I think we might push on given time, and we'll see if we can come back to some of the other ones at the end. Thanks, Vladimir.
No worries. All right, top tips. Let's jump straight ahead. Okay, so some of the stuff we already covered earlier, but this is just, I guess, hammering the point home. And also, you get great little number icons on the screen as well. So the governing document should contain the legal name of the organization. We encourage you to put the objects, so the charitable purpose of the organization, as a clause into the governing document. We also encourage the entities to have a non-for-profit clause and a winding up clause in their document to confirm its not-for-profit nature. Now, it is also important that it's actually the finalized, executed, approved document that you're sending through. So if it's just a working document, if it's something that hasn't actually been approved by the general meeting or by the committee or by the trustees or what have you, that's not something that we regard to be governing document. So a draft is not a governing document. It needs to be actually a document that has been approved by the organization as its governing rules. All right, let's move ahead. Okay, so 2 is probably, if there's one thing that you take away from this presentation, this is probably it. Ensure that the entity pursues solely charitable purposes, or any activities that it conducts would have to be in furtherance of charitable purposes. Now, I alluded to some things earlier. So, for example, if an entity conducts minor commercial operations, if it runs an op shop or what have you, that in itself is not a charitable purpose. Like selling items in itself is not a charitable purpose. But it is conducted to further some charitable purpose. So, for instance, it's the money is then going to support, people that are homeless or whatever, or even, if it's to support a local church or to a local school or whichever charitable purpose that is. Number 3, ensure your governing document reflects the charitable purposes above. So I already spoke about most of these things already. So avoid missing objects. So actually, if you're pursuing a purpose, do say that you're pursuing it. Vague objects. So if we can't decipher which purpose it is, we may have to contact you and ask you to change the object. And of course, non-charitable objects. So while there may be some activities that are conducted that are not in themselves charitable, but they're in furtherance of charitable purpose, don't put in matters into the objects that are not actually charitable, right? So your objects should focus on the charitable nature of your entity. All right, let's move ahead. Right, so number 4, I think we already spoke about this in detail as well. Ensure your organization operates for the public benefit. So when we say public benefit, we mean either the general public, so the general community as a whole, or it's a sufficient group. So it may be a group in Australia, it may be a group overseas for most of the charitable purposes, not for all of them, but for most. But it needs to be identifiable, sufficiently public group. It's not just for the benefit of a select group of members or for a group of select relatives, that type of thing. It needs to be actually sufficiently public section of the general community. Number 5, only apply for charitable subtypes that reflect charitable purposes you actively pursue or in the planning stages to pursue. So as I alluded to earlier, an entity does not have to have begun operations in order to be eligible to be registered as a charity, but it needs to have a clear plan to do so if it hasn't begun operating. Obviously, if you're already pursuing charitable purpose, if you're already operating, that's great, that's fine. But in terms of applying for the subtypes, apply for the subtypes that the organization is actually, when you apply selecting a subtype, the subtypes should reflect the charitable purposes that the entity is actively pursuing. Let's move ahead. So understand the governance standards. So again, as I alluded to earlier, ACNC has a lot of information on its website about the governance standards. So I do suggest that prior to applying and even after you apply and after you become registered as a charity, that's something that you need to constantly be aware of. So these requirements, they don't just stop once you're registered as a charity, they're always there. So charity cannot just sort of stop and go, well, now that I'm registered, I'm not going to pursue charitable purpose. I'm not going to be a non-for-profit. I'm not going to pursue governance standards. That getting registered is just the first step. You then have a whole heap of obligations going forward as a charity, right? So it comes with benefits, but it also comes with a lot of responsibilities as well. So the common questions that we ask in relation to governance standards is to make sure that the organization has good procedures for conflicts of interest management and also financial affairs. So these are the types of things that either can be managed by standalone policies, or again, they can be introduced in the governing document as well. So you can have provisions in your model rules or in your constitution that talks about responsible persons, so directors, committee members, etc., declaring conflicts of interest and how those conflicts of interest are managed, or how the financial affairs of the operation are being managed. Again, keep it in mind that this is all for the benefit of a charitable purpose, right? So it's funds just can't go missing and things like that. The funds the organization collects through its fundraising or other operations, they need to be forwarded to charitable purposes. So how do you do that? All right. So number 7, ensure the organization's ABN is active and matches its governing document, and ensure the entity type is correct. So again, if there are any issues with the ABN, reach out to ABR and double check to make sure that it's the ABN is active, that it hasn't been post-dated or cancelled, and all those details on the ABR listing are correct. All right, so number 8, ensure organization has at least the minimum number of responsible people required by its governing document. What that means is if you have model rules, for example, that state that the minimum number of committee members you have is 5, but you only provide 1 or 2 or 3, that means you're not actually abiding by your own governing document. So we're not going to be able to register you until you provide the correct number, right? So make sure once you adopt a governing document, that is actually governing your organization. That's in the name. Governing is in the name. So make sure that you actually follow by its provisions, right? So if it says that you have 5 committee members or 3 directors or whichever number it is in your governing document, you need to abide by that. And provide details of all responsible persons in your application. So some organizations, they do have the correct number or even a larger number than the minimum, but they don't provide all the details in the application, and that may cause problems as well. Because once you are a responsible person of a charity, we should have your details in case we, for whatever reason, need to reach out to you and to double check on your obligations, etc. We don't. Once the register is updated, and if you are registered as a charity, the link goes up. The names of the responsible persons will be listed on the charity register, right? But the private details of the responsible persons are not being disclosed, right? So the details that you submit there for the ACNC, in case for whatever reason ACNC needs to reach out to contact the clients. But in terms of privacy, be rest assured that your private details will not be disclosed in the public sphere. All right, let's move ahead. All right, so extra tips, which is in relation to deductible gift recipient. Now, as I alluded to earlier, it's somewhat out of scope of this particular presentation, but it's certainly something that is very important to a lot of charities. So again, I would encourage you to reach out to the ACNC website, acnc.gov.au DGR. Also, if you so wish, you can also reach out to the ATO, because technically they're the ones that administer deductible gift recipient provisions. But essentially, what you need to be aware of is that in terms of to be able to get DGR, most of the organizations, there are obviously some other government entities, etc., that may have DGR endorsement. But generally speaking, for most of the types of organizations, you do first require to be registered as a charity these days in order for you to be eligible for DGR endorsement. So if you want to have deductible, if you want your donors to be able to get those deductible gift recipient donations, then it's applying for charity will be important as well. But it's important for you to also make sure that when you're selecting the ATO information at the bottom of your ACNC application, make sure that you select the correct information there as well, because we are trying again to make sure that everything is sort of comprehensive. And once you submit information to us, we process and we send it on to the ATO. But if the ATO information is not correct, if the DG application that you submitted is not correct, you will then get separate questions from the ATO, and you may, end up having to do twice as much work. When again, if you prepared everything ahead of time, then so make sure that all the questions before just sort of ticking or skipping through the next section, you actually consider what the question is asking. Any more questions?
Question, no, that's what we've I had a question. Once, presuming all the information you provided in your application is fabulous, how long in general is the turnaround time for registration?
Look, naturally, we try to process them as quickly as possible, and obviously, first in, best dressed, right? So we work from the back and sort of try to get them in as quickly as we can. Now, because of all these things that are happening at the moment with the reforms that we alluded to earlier. Now, before these reforms, there was the deductible gift recipient reforms, etc., etc., etc. So there is a lot of there are a lot of applications that have been happening, and it's not, I was going to say just recently, but it's not just recently. Basically, the last 12 months or so, there've been, for various reasons, there have been a lot of applications, and I'm expecting this to continue going forward. So currently, I would probably say in terms of just waiting before your application is assessed, probably about 4 weeks, right? Now, but however, once the application is assessed, it doesn't mean that on the day you will be registered. The analyst, even if the information is great, the analyst still may need time to read through everything, have a look at the governing document, so that in itself may take, 1, 2, or 3 more weeks, depending on the complexity of the application. Some of the applications are very straightforward. They can be processed in 2 hours. Some of the applications are very, very complex, and they may need weeks to really analyze every single detail. So, but the only thing I can say really is that we'll try to attend to all of them from the earliest applicant that we can see. That's how we process them, and we obviously try to get to them as quickly as we can.
Thank you.
All right, let's move on then to Charities' ongoing application. And do you want to jump onto that one, Gulna?
Yeah, thank you, Vlad. Yeah, so as Vlad mentioned earlier, so your interaction with ACNC does not come to a stop once your organization has been approved for charity registration. Then comes the most important part, that it's not only that your organization is registered as a charity, but what it must do to make sure that it remains entitled to registration, what it should do to maintain that charity registration, right? So this section looks at what are some of the ongoing obligations to the ACNC that your organization must be mindful of and make sure that it follows. So the first one is that a charity must notify the ACNC of changes, first of all, to its legal name, which is the legal name for the charity, or if there's been a change to the address for service. So for us, the address for service is your official registered address that you've provided us. So if there's any important communication that we need to send, we can send it to you. So we have 2 types of addresses for service that we collect. One is the email address and one is the physical or postal address. So it's important that you make sure that this is kept up to date, because if we don't have the correct information, or if you've provided us with an email address at the time of registration, and since then 6 months later you've changed it to something else, but you haven't notified ACNC of the changes, then all the important reminders may be going to an email address that's no longer being monitored, and you may miss important communication that's relevant for your ongoing obligations. Again, if with the responsible people, the board members or the committee members who are responsible for governing your charity, if someone has resigned mid-year because of other commitments, or sometimes generally it is when you have your annual general meeting and an entire new board has been elected. So it's important that you let us know that this is what has happened, because for us, these are the people who are responsible for governing the charity. So we must know if there has been a change. As I said earlier, we are digital by default. So it's very, very important at the time of application that you also have a think about who is the best person who should be responsible for this. So amongst the board members, if you feel there's one person you can nominate and that they will be responsible for making sure that all the important changes are being notified to us through the portal, it's important to have a think and a discussion amongst yourself that, that this person should be responsible. There are timeframes associated with these notifications of changes. So if it's a small charity, you have 60 days to let us know of these changes. And if it's a medium or large charity, you have 28 days. So it's important that you let us know of these changes within those specified timeframes. So that's the first one. The second one is that registered charities must lodge an annual information statement each year. Again, this is normally done through our online charity portal. So for those of you who are not familiar with what an annual information statement is, I like to explain it by comparing it to the tax returns that we as individuals need to lodge with the tax office. So, registered charities, if they have been granted an income tax exemption, so they no longer need to lodge tax returns with the tax office. However, because they're registered with us as charities, every year registered charities must lodge this annual information statement with us. So it's an online form, And it has questions about, what are the charities' contact details? Who are the charities' current responsible people? What are the different programs that the charity has run? Who are the beneficiaries that it's helping? And then there is a section on finances. So that will talk about, what were the different expenses that the charity had to incur? What were some of the sources of income? And what is good is that for each year that a charity needs to lodge this annual information statement, we simultaneously publish a very extensive guide for that particular year, and it has a lot of detailed information for each question that we ask you. So it's good practice that when the time comes for you to actually complete one of these statements, that you refer to the guide, and that will help you to understand how you need to complete this particular statement. And if you ever are stuck at any particular point, you've looked at the guide and you still are not sure what you need to do, we have an advice services helpline. You can always call us, and our advice service officers will be able to help you with any specific questions that you are particularly struggling with. Thank you, Anna. If you could move to the next slide. Continuing with the ongoing obligations. So a charity is also required to keep financial records and operational records. So financial records are, records which tell us about, the financial transactions that your charity undertakes. It could be the expenses, the incomes, any purchases that the charity has made. Common examples would be the bank statements, receipts for purchases made. If you have a bookkeeper and they have ledgers that you maintain, cash books, things like that. Operational records are any other document that your charity has, and it tells us that this is what your charity is doing to operate as a charity, and that it is complying with the ACNC Act and with tax law. So examples could be your governing document. That's an operational record because it has information about how your charity is going to be governed. Meeting minutes from your regular meetings or from the annual general meeting. Again, you see how it's giving us information about what your charity is doing, about its operations. So it's important that you keep these records. You need to keep them for at least 7 years. They need to be in English. And again, on our website, we have a lot of useful information about record keeping, and there is a very useful checklist as well, which you can download. And I highly recommend, especially for new charities, that if you download these resources, you have them handy, and it just helps you to make sure that you are being compliant. And last but not the least, and we've touched upon this previously, so once you are registered as a charity, you obviously need to make sure that you're complying with the governance standards. And if your charity operates overseas as well, or if it sends funds overseas, it also needs to comply with the external conduct standards. Anna, if you could go to the next slide, please. And so these are the 6 governance standards. So they're listed here. I'm not going to read them out to you because I'm conscious of the amount of time we have left, but that link there, acnc.gov.au/governance standards. If you go to our website, it has quite a lot of useful information that will help you get your head around what you need to do. And if you find after reading those resources that there is something you do need to address, maybe there is a policy that your charity needs to create in order to make sure that it's complying with the governance standards, then it is in your best interest to do so. We also have a few self-assessment documents, which will ask you a series of questions, and that also helps you to assess whether your charity is complying with the governance standards or with the external conduct standards. And as I said before, there's more information about the ongoing obligations at acnc.gov.au/ongoing obligations. Thank you, Anna. And this is for you to keep in touch with us. We would love to have you, keep in touch through all these various resources that we have. We do have a newsletter. It's a monthly newsletter, The Charitable Purpose, and it's sent via email. We have our web guidance, and we also have our own webinars and podcasts that we create for charities. So highly recommend that you look at those. And if you need any further information, you can always contact us. So I'll hand it over to Anna now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gulna. Thank you, Vladimir. And a big thank you to everyone for putting so many questions in the Q&A. And I'm sorry if we haven't got to them. I'll just briefly run through where you may be able to where you can get some more help that may be able to answer some of these questions. And then if we have another minute at the end, we'll answer a few. So you can get, there are 4 key ways you can get more help from not-for-profit law. So much like the ACNC, we also have a newsletter, and you can sign up in the news tab to that, which will keep you updated to changes in the sector. You can also access our free legal resources under the free resources tab. Now, there's been quite a few questions in the Q&A about things like, well, how do we choose our legal structure? How do we, do we have to be set up before we can apply for charitable registration? I recommend you have a look at our resources, which are very helpful for this. So on the right-hand side of the screen is a getting started tool. So that's an online tool that can help you choose your legal structure and give you an idea of what you need to do to set up your organization, and also touches on lightly on the becoming a charity as well. On the left-hand side, there's also a fact sheet about should your group register as a charity, which has a lot of the information that Gulna and Vladimir have touched on today, and also includes links to the ACNC website, so you can find out some more information there. So hopefully that's answered a few of the questions that you had in the Q&A. We also have, so the third way you can get help from us is from our webinars. So we run live webinars like today, and we've got 2 more coming up, one on screening checks for not-for-profits and another on starting a social enterprise. Now, we also have a couple of webinars on demand. The most relevant for today is the one that we ran the week before last on understanding recent tax reforms. So that the ATO came along to that and explained the changes to the assessment of self-assessment for the income tax exemption. So if I saw a couple of questions around that in the Q&A, I would recommend you go and have a look at that free on-demand webinar, then that may be able to help you with your questions there. Now, we also provide free legal assistance. Again, I saw quite a few questions in the Q&A about, well, where do I get help, pro bono help from a lawyer for this? We do provide pro bono assistance, and you can make an application on our website there under the Get Help from a Lawyer tab. But we do have quite strict eligibility criteria, so please be mindful of this when you apply, and you can find the eligibility criteria there on the website. So, for example, we don't help groups that are not yet incorporated, which are entirely new, and those type of groups can go to our Getting Started tool, which can be really useful. Even if you aren't eligible for advice, you can make an application through our service and get targeted, you can get information from us as well. So you may wish to do that. So we do have time for a couple of no, I don't think we do have time. Very sadly, I don't think we do have time. I'm so sorry, everyone, for if we haven't got to your question. But if you did have a moment, we would love you to complete the survey that I've put in the chat. The survey is really great because it tells us how we can do better, how we can improve. So getting your feedback is really valuable. So if you had a moment, I'd love if you could complete that survey. So we'll send the PDF of the slides through to you and a link to the recording. I'd like to make a very special thank you for Gulna and Vladimir for taking their time out today and to giving us all this information. It was really comprehensive, and I'm sure it was very, very helpful. So thank you very much, both of you. And I will let the rest of you go and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. But thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for putting such fabulous questions in.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Anna.
Okay.